Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Changing Governance in the Mid-19th Century British State. And I'm Dr. Stuart Mitchell, as you can see there on the first slide, the author of Unit 14. And what I'll be talking about today, if you're expecting a lecture which is going to be all about the 1867 Reform Act, which is a large part of my unit, then I will be talking about that, but perhaps rather less than you might expect. Instead, what I'm going to be mainly talking about is exactly this: the changing governance, in a very broad sense, in the mid-19th century. And when I'm talking about the British state here, I have to make an apology to anybody who lives in Ireland or Scotland, because mostly what I'll be talking about is the changes to governance that occurred in England and Wales, because the systems in place in Ireland and to some extent Scotland are rather different from the systems that pertain in England and Wales. So most of my examples, occasionally I'll talk about Scotland, but most of the examples are relevant principally to England and Wales tonight. So again, my apologies, I suppose, for those of you who are who live outside of those two nations. Okay. Now, when you're approaching the 19th century, and indeed when you're approaching any long period of change, one of the best ways of kind of conceptualizing what change has occurred and how it's occurred is by looking at snapshots of the start and end points of a particular time period. And so that's what I've got here. That's what's showing on the slide there. This is to show, in a sense, what happened in the 19th century. Because if we understand what the start point is and we understand what the end point is, then we'll have a clearer idea of what it is we need to explain in the interim between those two bookends. So at the end of 18th century Britain, which is where A225 starts, looks radically different to the Britain that we see on the eve of the First World War. At the end of the 18th century, Britain's polity is politically dominated by the landed class. And that's not simply in terms of wealth, but in terms of the actual holding of political power. There are very few people from outside of the landed classes who, for example, sit in Parliament. Also, it is largely governed and regulated by local prerogative and the local state. You will, of course, have seen some of this in TMA 2 when you were writing about the tensions between the local state and the national state. That's what Britain looks like at the end of the 18th century. The state is small, the local state that governs most people's lives and what most people will be familiar with. That's the parish in essence, and it's got relatively few people in positions of power there. So it's really, when we talk about the local state, we're really talking about maybe half a dozen people who are in charge of things like the maintenance of the roads, policing, justice, the dispensation of poor relief, and so on and so forth. That's what the principal experience of most people will be, is that they are governed on a local basis. Britain is still also mainly an agrarian country. There is some growth in manufactures, but overall, Britain is still essentially agrarian. And although we've seen the kind of the beginnings of what we tend to call, quote unquote, the Industrial Revolution, most of Britain's economic production is agrarian. Likewise, it's mostly Anglican, at least in England. The Anglican Church, Church of England, is the established church in England. There's also an established Anglican Church in Ireland, incidentally. But the difference, of course, being that in England, at least, most people do adhere to that particular denomination, whereas in Ireland, of course, mostly they don't. The church is established in the sense that it is part, it still is, it's considered to be part of the state. And the influence of the Church of England is not only in terms of faith, but also in terms of politics as well. So that's important to understand at the beginning of the 19th century. Moreover, Britain also has a very limited national franchise for the election of people to Parliament. That, of course, changes, as you well know. It changes in 1832 and again in 1867 and yet again in the 1880s. And that's really one of the major political changes that the 19th century brings about, and one of the major political changes that the course majors on. It is also relatively socially and geographically immobile. When I say relatively, I mean in comparison to the late 19th century, not in the sense of in comparison to, say, continental Europe. In continental Europe, actually, it's relatively fluid when you compare with a lot of the European continent. But people tend not to travel very far, or if they do travel very far, then it tends to be in kind of short hops within their, not far from their local parish, or maybe to their within their local county. So it's geographically immobile in that sense. People don't tend to move around quite as much. Transport system, of course, is very much less well developed than it is at the end of the 19th century. And it's also socially relatively immobile in the sense that they're people moving between different classes. And I use that term in inverted commas because classes, as you probably gathered from reading Block 1 and some of the units in Block 2 too, is a problematic term for the 18th century, but with a bit of back projection there, mobility between classes and changes in socio-economic status, as we would call it these days, are relatively few and far between. And there's also almost no genuinely national press. That will become important. The reason I've stressed that will become clear later in the slides. So that's what Britain looks like at the end of the 18th century, broadly speaking, with some exceptions. But by the start of 20th century Britain, we get a politics that is far more open to middle class and indeed even working class influence. And we begin to see that through the changes to the franchise. But it's not simply about at the national level, it's also at the local level too. There is far more input, if you like, from middle class people and working class people to the way in which politics works and the way in which policy is worked out. Unlike the end of the 18th century, Britain's also largely governed and regulated by a central state. That local prerogative has all ebbed away or been seized by the centre. It's not in every respect, of course, but nonetheless, the central state intervenes far more in people's lives and is recognized as intervening more in people's lives than it would have done at the beginning of the 19th century. And that centralization also brings about a level of more uniformity, a more uniform experience for individuals within the population. Okay. And likewise, economically, the economy has drastically changed, so that although there is still a fairly substantial agricultural sector, manufacturing is dominant in the in Britain's economy. Likewise, it's more religiously diverse. So the Anglican confession dominates politics. One actually had to be Anglican in order to sit in Parliament, for example, at the beginning of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, that's not true. Catholics, nonconformists, and so forth are far more involved in politics, and also Britain is increasingly secular, and by which I mean that the church has less input into affairs of state. So, for example, its influence over education is considerably less at the beginning of the 20th century than it had been a century earlier. It also has a much broader, although still male, national franchise. When we approached the First World War, something in the region of about 4/5 of adult British men have the vote. There's still a few people who haven't, and of course that's corrected in the immediately after the end of the First World War with the 1918 Representation of the People Act. But nonetheless, there are some people who are still without the vote, but still far, far more at the beginning of the 20th century than at the beginning of the 19th. It's also considerably more socially and geographically mobile in comparison to how it had been at the end of the 18th century. So people move around a lot more. Transport network is much better. Infrastructure is much better. So there's more geographical mobility. People are able to travel greater distances in order to do work, for example, but also the movement between classes, if you like, and people's socioeconomic status is not so fixed as it had been at the end of the 18th century. And there is now a widespread national press. I'll give you some figures on that. So the circulation, the readership of the national press by the end of the 1870s is 30 times higher than that at the beginning of the 1830s. That's not quite, obviously, the whole of the century, but you get the impression, you get the sense of how that has expanded, how that's mushroomed enormously. Okay, so in short, what we have here is a system of local autonomy and regional diversity having been replaced by one of central supervision and national uniformity. And that movement, obviously there's some caveats in that nonetheless, but that general broad movement you could talk about as a movement to or towards modernity as we understand it. And of course, that's something that 225 talks a lot about, that movement towards modernity. Okay, so that change from the late 18th century to the early 20th century has been labelled by some historians as a 19th century revolution in government. And this was a kind of a live debate for most of the period between the 1950s and the 1980s, particularly as documents get released from the Public Record Office, as was. So this was something that a lot of historians wrote about in that time period. It's less so now. If that transition is a revolution, it's kind of based on the drive towards urbanization, the need on the part of government to resist things like social disorder, and also the need to raise taxation in order to administer better the broad sweep of British society. So if it was a revolution, what's causing that? Partly it's the rapid growth of population. So you get this mushrooming of population, particularly in the last few decades of the 18th century and the first few of the 19th century. And that means that the local state, i.e. the parish in most cases, becomes more stretched because there are more people who need more services, if you like, in inverted commas, including and perhaps specifically poor relief. That is coupled with a rise in capitalism, industrialization, and also Benthamite liberalism, which tends towards a way of conceptualizing society where rationality and a series of rules are considered to be paramount in the kind of the most efficient way in which society can be organized. Labour becomes more mobile, not hugely mobile by comparison to the end of the 19th century, but it does become more mobile, particularly as people migrate from agrarian areas to relatively more industrialized areas in search of work. There's a rise and a sense of a crystallization of the middle class, and that is given its due, so to speak, in 1832, when a large portion of the middle class, but not all, are enfranchised. These changes, these kind of underlying structural changes, create new social problems and the necessity for their practical solution. And this, in turn, spurs the central state, according to those people who believe in this idea of a 19th century government revolution, spurs the central state to extend its reach into more areas of human life. And this was particularly driven by the Whig liberal administrations and their bureaucratization from the 1830s onwards. The Whig liberal administrations are, of course, animated to some extent by this the dominance of Benthamite liberalism within the broad intellectual debate of the time. So for some historians, that's more or less an inevitable revolution because of this kind of the mass of these big long-term structural trends. And I've given you a quote here from Oliver McDonough, who's one proponent of that view. What was especially significant, he said, was that social reform necessitated a government instrument to execute and maintain it. And that means commissioners, inspectorates, and executive officers. Such a government instrument in its turn implied a government or state policy something continuous and constant and apart from and above the alternating ministries, that is, the different parties who from time to time will have replaced one another as governments. So this is, it implied, according to McDonough, it implied the creation of bureaucracy, or in technical terms, I suppose, the civil service. Okay. And the epitome of that process was supposedly the new Poor Law, the 1834 Poor Law, whereas there is that massive centralisation away from the parish to the central state, and the central state lays down rules as to how how poor relief should be given. And don't underestimate poor relief. It is as an animating factor, because it's an enormous expense, and for a great number of the population, they will have recourse to some form of poor relief at some point in their lives. So it is it's kind of front and center as in terms of policy. But you can also see that bureaucratization and that drawing to the center of power in health. The rules are laid down for the way in which towns and cities should cope with their public health problems. You can see it in policing, prisons, asylums, railways, taxation, and so on and so forth. All of those areas become more and more drawn into the central state's ambit. Now, the question is then, of course, whether or not that necessarily constitutes a revolution. And I'm going to ask your opinion on that by showing you this poll. So you have an opportunity now to vote on the basis of the reading that you have done so far. Now, that may be that you haven't got as far as Unit 14. It doesn't really matter too much, because you will have some knowledge of this through your reading up to now, and through your work on TMA2 in particular, and to some extent TMA3. So by all means, have a vote now. Do you agree with McDonough's description of 19th century government undergoing a revolution? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like most people have voted. I will now broadcast the results. Okay, so you should all be able to see that now. Okay, now there's a fairly tight between yes, but that's not the whole picture, and no, revolution is not an accurate term for what happened. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you why you've formed those particular opinions, but it's interesting to see your critical awareness developing there. Okay, thank you very much for that. Obviously, on the next slide, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about this particular debate. So, obviously, this, as with all things amongst historians, that view, the view that was espoused by McDonough and others, has been contested, of course. and that's important because the the reason why there are um, disputes and disagreements between historians, it's not particularly because we're an especially disputatious lot, but because it is only through the challenge of other people that we advance knowledge, if you like, which is one of the reasons why we constantly harp on about getting to grips with historiography for you. So as I say, this was contested. The McDonough view. Henry Paris kind of goes some way to agreeing with the revolution label and says, yes, it is a revolution of sorts, but this is perhaps what those of you who voted for it's not the whole picture had in mind. There's a missing out of the importance of ideas, or at least according to Henry Paris. And that's a quote from him there. There is nothing inevitable about the process by which institutions respond to changes in the society around them. So what was needed, according to Paris, there was also the influence of ideas, and in particular that was Benthamite liberalism. You might want to say that what's being conceptualized there is a peculiarly liberal modernity. Peter Bartrip pointed out that actually, although there was an awful lot of legislation, it was frequently ineffective or contested or not overseen. In other words, there was pushback from individual parishes and counties who didn't want to be kind of trammelled and coerced by the central state. Likewise, there wasn't enough in terms of, or weren't enough actual members of personnel in the civil service in the state to be able to oversee some of the changes that politicians enacted. So simply because something is passed by statute, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be very effectively policed. And that essentially was Bartrett's point, that the legislation that cascades out of Westminster is not always necessarily going to be very well policed. And that's largely because of there's a kind of a short-handedness in amongst the civil service. There simply aren't enough inspectors. There simply aren't enough executive officers to be able to keep an eye on how a piece of legislation is actually working out on the ground. And likewise, there's opposition to some of these pieces of legislation. You'll probably be familiar with the opposition to some of the police force legislation. Some counties simply didn't adopt that police force legislation to set up county forces, or they adopted it in a kind of a half-hearted, mealy-mouthed kind of way. And with the poor law in particular, there was an enormous amount of pushback against centralisation, both from parishes who didn't like the idea of their local prerogatives being overwhelmed by dictates from the metropole, and also from the poor themselves, who kind of very understandably didn't want to be confined in the workhouse. And then there are historians who reject the idea of a 19th century government revolution altogether, like John Press there. It says it's not a revolution, it's just a haphazard evolutionary process. Much legislation was permissive, so it wasn't something that the central government insisted that local bodies had to enact. I can go into that in a bit more detail in the questions if you like. And likewise, insufficient has been paid to parliament and high politics in developments. In other words, there are a lot of this legislation was contested even at the level of the central state, even at the level of parliament. More recently, David Eastwood has said that this debate has hit a dead end. Most historians now accept that, regardless of whether the changes amounted to a revolution, they cannot be seen as an inevitable and solely administrative tendency or force inspired largely by problem solving, and instead they need to be set within a context of politics that are both local and national, and broader cultural change, and that includes those sort of demographic changes that I was referring to earlier. Okay. So, as I say, if that debate kind of seems to have burnt itself out, but nonetheless, it is something that with which you need to engage, particularly if you're going to do an assignment on the ways in which governance changes over the 19th century. Now, you might have been wondering, of course, that where's democracy in all of this, and why is this important? And that's important because it's indicative of this kind of interaction between different forces within society. I've already talked about the without actually calling it that, the underlying structural change within the country as a whole. So that includes that mushrooming of population. It also includes class formations, so the middle class and the working class increasingly identifying themselves as being part of a single class with a certain number of common experiences. So those things percolate, and they take a long time to fully play out. That's why we tend to call those things structural changes. Now, that underlying structural change, as I've already indicated, has a big effect both on state regulation and centralization, regardless of whether or not you want to call that a revolution or not. Nonetheless, the state does do things. The new poor law is one particularly good example. Policing, I've also mentioned, because it's faced with a whole series of new kind of social problems and so forth, which are the consequence of that underlying structural change. It also has a very large effect on mass democratic participation, in the sense that there are now more people with more experiences in common, and they start to demand greater say over the way in which they are governed. Okay, so that underlying structure, that's why the arrows are of different thickness here. So you've got the underlying structural change has relatively large effects on the two boxes that sit below it. But there is also some feedback as well. But those arrows are more slender, because that the feedback is less, perhaps less dramatic. I'll give you an example though. So vaccination, for example, which you may have read about in Unit 10, I think it is made compulsory. Smallpox vaccination is made compulsory in 1853. So that's an element of state regulation, if you like. And it's made compulsory, but it's carried out by the unions. It's carried out by the poor law unions. So it's mandated from the centre, but it's the actual delivery of vaccination is done by and organised by local poor law unions. So that has, of course, an effect here as well. That has an effect on democratic participation. But what I'm concentrating on at the moment is how that then feeds back into underlying structural change. The idea is that the more people get vaccinated, particularly children, the more people get vaccinated against smallpox, the more people survive. And that does have, of course, a social structural change to the demography of the country. But as I say, that feedback is less strong than the big arrow coming down there, if you like. But there's also a two-way process going on between state regulation and centralization and mass democratic participation, in the two are kind of mutually reinforcing. The more the state regulates and controls people's lives, the more people want to have a say in those controls and that policy making. So the more people will tend to get involved in politics. Now that might be in the kind of obvious way of joining political parties or movements or whatever, but it also can play out in things like the development of organisations that are not expressly political but may have political viewpoints about certain things. So campaign groups for example, public health or temperance or something like that, or slightly more formal institutions like trade unions. And the more people get involved in politics, the more that prompts the state to respond with policy changes as people demand different things of it, if that makes sense. So that's why that's a two-way process between state centralization on the left-hand side there and increasing democratic participation on the right-hand side. Okay. And Little illustrates that structure, that kind of three-way structure that I've just given you better than Chartism. Chartism is kind of the epitome of that pretty modern, really, that modern interaction between those different factors. So I've already said that economic and social change arguably creates conditions, urbanization, economic exploitation, by which I mean things like factories and so forth. And with urbanization, people living close by, cheek by jowl, the greater spread of disease, working people begin to suffer in those conditions. And that's exacerbated by government change, most particularly through the new Poor Law, but also through other elements of centralisation. Unintentional, of course. I'm not saying that this is a deliberate ploy on behalf of the liberal state to do down the poor. That's probably not the case. But nonetheless, these two things come into confluence in the 1830s and 1840s, and so they bring about the development of this mass political modern movement, which we call Chartism. So although those social and economic phenomena do create problems and indeed suffering, they also create opportunities for people to organize. There's a developing transport network, of course, certainly from the 1830s with the development of the railways, better roads too. There's rising literacy, and increasingly there's a press to cater for that rising literacy. But that literacy also means that it's easier for the organizers of political movements to spread their message. There's a greater amount of organizational sophistication that is contingent on those demographic changes. And of course, as I've already mentioned, there's increasing class identification between members of the working class, in particular, to some extent, the middle class too. If you've already ploughed into Unit 14, Unit 14 is roughly where you should be at the moment. But there's don't worry if you're not, because we know that this course has all sorts of it's quite heavy in part. So if you're a little bit behind, don't worry about that. But if you have ploughed into Unit 14, you've probably already come across a quote from James Vernon. He's quite an important historian in this area, which I've put in. It's on page 339 of Unit 14, which kind of encapsulates Chartism as this exemplar of a modern political movement which is operating within the context of that model that I showed you on the previous slide. And Vernon says, incessant movement and tours around the country enabled these radical leaders to tie together divergent local struggles and organisations. In a single month during the Chartist agitation of 1839, Fergus O'Connor reportedly travelled 1,500 miles and spoke at 22 public meetings, often for several hours. This type of charismatic organisation, which incidentally is kind of pre, the charisma part of it is kind of pre 19th century. But this type of charismatic organisation was also enhanced by newspapers. The Northern Star, that's O'Connor's newspaper, sold 40,000 copies by 1839 and claimed a readership of 300,000. That's pretty big deal for the 1830s. Its format, which combined reporting on the local activities of Chartist groups, covered national politics, letters from its readers, and sensationalist crime stories, and this proved very effective in joining the dots of the movement. So that's I'll give you that because I thought it was quite rather a nice quote that kind of encapsulates some of the modern aspects of Chartism and why it kind of differs from political movements such as they are that existed prior to the mid-19th century. However, as you no doubt know, on its own terms at least, Chartism fails. But it does provide a kind of template for future movements such as the Reform League. The Reform League, if you haven't come across that yet, you will do very shortly. It's in the second half of Unit 14. And former Chartists created networks, which of course they're enabled to do by better literacy, better transport infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So they created networks which bore fruit in things like the cooperative movement and the new model unions. Moreover, the failure of Chartism gave its organisers certain lessons, in inverted commas. So it tended to ditch the hostile tactics of its later years, that's really from the mid-1840s onwards, and began instead to seek accommodation with middle-class reformers. Now that's particularly important because, as I said earlier on, although 1832 did enfranchise an awful lot of the middle class, it by no means enfranchised all of the middle class, and there is that stratum, what you might call the lower middle class, was still often without a vote, even in the 1850s. And that group grew in size, grew in number, as did the working class after 1832, and becomes important in terms of creating a continuum, if you like, across the classes. The Whig liberal reforms to government also created momentum. That's because the more areas of people's lives that were brought under the umbrella of central state supervision, and I've given you some examples there: County Asylum Act of 1853, the Vaccination Act, which I've already mentioned, Counter and Borough Police Act, which I've also alluded to. All of those things, because they intervene in people's lives and experiences, then people want to say, of course, in how they are governed by those new institutions and those new policies. So there is this builds into a head of steam for more formalized mass democratic participation. And alongside that, you get a shift in ideas away from Benthamite liberalism and towards a more interventionist Gladstonian liberalism, which stresses not so much rationality and rules and efficiency, but instead stresses moral improvement. So that Gladstonian liberalism is beginning to crystallize in the 1850s and reaches its apogee in the 1860s. And that brings us, rather belatedly, I suppose, to the 1867 Reform Act. So by the time of the mid 1860s, franchise extension of some kind looked highly likely. And although the first attempt, the first Liberal attempt to pass legislation in order to enfranchise more working class men, of course, didn't pass the first time, there was a sense that it was almost inevitable, not quite inevitable, because historians don't like using that term. So there was on the back of the lessons learned from Chartism and the changes that had occurred during the 1850s, somewhat under the radar. And Donald Loftus at the beginning of Block 2 talks about the 1850s being an age of equipoise, and of course she doesn't mean that in the sense that everything goes completely quiet and passive, but at the same time the instances of truly kind of socially disruptive upheaval that you see with things like Chartism, anti-poor law movement and so forth are much diminished in the 1850s. But instead, in that period, what's being built up is a mass, but still peaceful and well-organized movement towards more democracy. And slowly, political parties, particularly the Liberal Party, but also the Conservative Party to some extent, have been persuaded, if not of the moral right of extending the suffrage to more men, then at least of the necessity. That's partly because of the demographic changes that had occurred, and the need, of course, to start to garner support and votes from the burgeoning working class. Now that, of course, comes to fruition in 1867. For a while, there was in the 1970s, there were some historians, particularly Royden Harrison, who thought that the 1867 Reform Act was brought about because of the fear of mass insurrection. That's generally a product of the rather fevered debates that went on in the 1970s that it bears any relation to historical accuracy. But there was nonetheless a mass movement in the country, and it did kind of propel forward some of the necessary changes in, at least in mindset, but also in the arithmetic of Parliament, which enabled that Reform Act to pass. Now, I've already mentioned Gladstone's 1866 bill, which had fallen apart partly because of his inept parliamentary management. He kind of thought that simply, moral rightness would force the bill through, but was sadly rather naive on that point. Disraeli was a lot more canny, of course, much less principled than Gladstone, but much better at putting together a coalition which would enable his bill to pass, and that's why ultimately it's perhaps strangely the Conservative Party that brings in and successfully enacts the quite dramatic extension to the franchise that occurs in 1867. But even then, even if we concentrate mainly on the kind of that Gladstone-Disraeli clash, which has the attraction of being kind of flamboyant and interesting. Nonetheless, even if that's the main factor driving the enactment of 1867, nonetheless, it wouldn't have occurred at all without that context of longer-term structural change. The example of Chartism, which slowly grows into a mass movement for democracy, and of course the expansion of the central state. So those, again, going back to that triangle model that I mentioned earlier on, that's the context, and without understanding that, it's impossible to understand the passage of the 1867 Reform Act abstracted from that context. And so the aftermath of 1867 was, in fact, actually to propel forward the process of democratization and centralization. Curiously enough, it certainly didn't stop it in its tracks. It intensifies pressure for a still wider national franchise, having the door being open a crack, easier to put pressure on from the point of view of those who wished democracy to be expanded still further. So, and that also includes extending the suffrage to women, and some women, not many, but some women do get the local vote in 1869, one of Gladstone's first pieces of reform after returning to power in 1868. That allows them to vote, subject to certain sort of property qualifications, for local corporations. But it also, the 1867 Act, forces other institutions into organisational centralisation, in particular political parties, both the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, and when it comes about, the Labour Party, although that's a decade or so hence, have to have a central organisation, because that's absolutely essential for garnering votes and appealing to this new enfranchised electorate. And that requires a more consistency of message, a much better on the ground organisation in the constituencies. So you get the development of things like constituency agents who kind of run the constituency and prep their candidates and so on and so forth. So that's a type of organisational centralisation which is apart from the state, but is still part of that kind of trend towards intervention and centralisation that we observed earlier on. It also contributed. The Act contributed to the institutionalization of the working class in the sense that now that more working men could vote, by no means all of them, but more of them, then they could organise, and that institutionalisation expresses itself particularly through the development of trades unions and also ultimately the Labour Party, as well, as you'll see when you get to block 3. It also means that there is much more legislation that is working class orientated, or either to help in one way or another, in inverted commas, the working class between 1868, which is the Gladstone Ministry, and 1877, which is when Disraeli returns to power. Or rather, Disraeli returns to power in the 1870s. But both those ministries, back to back, one Liberal, one Conservative, pass an awful lot of legislation which is orientated towards the working class. The right to picket, for example, is passed by Disraeli's administration towards the back end of the 1870s. But there's also other stuff like the improvement or attempted improvement to housing conditions, the removal of slums, more public health measures and so forth, all of which could be seen in one way or another to have a kind of a working class flavour to them. Educational reform, on the other hand, is something that is far more associated with Gladstone than it is with the Conservatives. And Gladstone's view is that it's necessary to have educational reform. Now we have this newly enfranchised portion of the population, and that will morally uplift the new electorate. So they are able to exercise their votes as good citizens with prudence and sound judgment and so forth. But the Reform Act also caused problems. So, for example, the 1868 election is held using exactly the same mechanisms as had existed prior to 1867. So there was still public voting. There was still only one polling place, in most cases, only one polling place per constituency. And constituencies could be quite sizable, particularly in more rural areas. And it was associated, 1868 was associated with a good deal of kind of social disorder, particularly on polling day itself. And this forces the government to consider introducing the secret ballot as an attempt to solve some of those problems, so that you don't have the potential threat of intimidation from the mob, for example, in public voting. But above all, it seems to have promoted more government regulation and indeed further shrinkage of the local state and local idiosyncrasies. So part of the story of the 19th century, as far as small p politics goes, is that movement from the local to the national, central state, and the kind of withering away, if you like, of certain local idiosyncrasies. Okay, that's pretty much all I have to say now. With one eye on the time, I'll stop the recording